Jefferson once said that the tree of liberty is watered with the blood of patriots. Such was the American Revolution. The American War of Independence went on for 8 years. Tens of thousands of casualties on the battlefield and many more off. It was a war that affected every American. It was not fought in some distant country. It was fought in their front yards, their backyards. It affected everyone with great cost of life and even more of money, something that the new colonies did not have in their revolutionary state. France, however, provided that money and provided the military assistance that made it possible for America to win its independence. But it won by a long, dreadful war that the British people would refuse eventually to fund and to refuse to accept the casualties, and their focus on their ancient enemy, France, allowed them finally to settle a peace with America. The Americans sent a delegation, not to England, but France, and they met there in Paris with the British delegation. Unfortunately, the delays in that kind of negotiation were troubled by the fall of several ministries in the process, and the Americans had a difficult time even getting there themselves. Some of them had trouble at sea, others were very sick, but when they all sat down to the negotiating table, they understood a few things. The first was the king had finally realized that independence needed to be granted. That was the first prerequisite for the Americans. In fact, they had basically declined to negotiate any details if that were not presumed at the beginning of the conference, although it is the first article and defines it very carefully. Franklin and Adams negotiated separately in some ways, sometimes undermining one another as they negotiated, but no one was playing the game fairly. France had its own objectives, Spain its own concerns, England another set entirely, and eventually it was decided that America would negotiate separately from its allies. But that was in agreement with earlier contracts. The American question was quite simple, really. Should we stop fighting? Everyone agreed on that one very quickly. Yes, please. Followed by, where is America? Where are the boundaries? What's included? What not? Also the question of communication. Since it was going to take months for everyone to realize that the war was going to be over, there were clauses about what happens next. How do you stop the fighting? Return all the things that you capture from the enemy between now when we agree there's peace and when they actually hear that there's peace. And these were laid out in fairly conventional terms. The treaty is very simple and very short in some ways, but it also fits the 18th century model of being very clear and very precise. Once the agreement was made in Paris, however, it still required several agreements elsewhere. It had to go to London. The king had to admit that he had lost. And he is known to this day as the king that lost America. And it mentally disordered him to some extent for years to come. He was known to rave in years about his colonies when they were long gone. It also had to be approved in America, and there was part of the problem. Where was Congress at any given day? The British Army had chased it out of at least 4 cities during the war, and it had moved around because no one could sustain it for very long. And after all, there weren't very many American cities worth the name in the first place. So, when they first sent the treaty over to be approved, they sent it to New Jersey, where they thought Congress was. But it had already moved to Annapolis.
Upon confirmation that Congress was going to move to Annapolis from Princeton, we were assured we would provided spaces within the Maryland State House for the conduct of the business of the Congress. We knew that General Washington was en route from New York to resign his commission here in December of 1783.
And there, in a rather dramatic and very important ceremony for America, instead of holding the power of the military over the civilian government, as his own officers had begged him to do in Newburgh, he surrendered that power, keeping the civil government superior to the military.
That's, of course, an enormously significant event. One would have the difficulty finding in world history a time when a military leader voluntarily surrendered that kind of power. So a huge precedent is set in Annapolis.
But unfortunately, when the 19th of December came about and General Washington arrived in Annapolis, we were still with only 7 states represented as delegates.
They debated for 2 days as to whether or not they could process this treaty with just the 7 states, or could they do it with 5, or did they have to really wait for 9? All of that time, many delegates were trying to come to Congress, but many of them were not trying very hard. Congress was a lot of work. There was no pay. And it was the middle of the depth of winter. But eventually, just enough delegates arrive. They conclude that they must have the 9. They gain that, they read the treaty, and unanimously approve it.
We proceeded with the actual vote on the treaty itself, and then the signing of the proclamation within the Maryland State House, proclaiming that the treaty had been accepted.
The Treaty of Paris proclamation is a typed document, which is different than the handwritten Treaty of Paris, which is signed on September 3, 1783. So you have the handwritten version that's signed by the delegation that negotiated it, and then in Annapolis they typed up the Treaty of Paris, and then they have the additional paragraph that basically says we hereby approve it. And it's ratified by the Congress, but only signed by President Thomas Mifflin and Secretary Charles Thompson. Now, when I say President Mifflin, I'm talking about the presidents under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation are ratified on March 1st, 1781. So you have the term president being used prior to the Constitution, but these were presidents of Congress.
Putting the stamp. And if he could approach him, he could be written.
Today in the Senate chamber of the Maryland State House on January 14th, 1784, the Congress must vote on whether to ratify the Treaty of Paris, signed September 3rd, 1783, in Paris by John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay on the American side, and David Hartley on the British side. This treaty officially ends our Revolutionary War. Establishes British recognition of our new independent nation. And creates a number of agreements regarding boundaries and trade. Delegates from 9 of the 13 states must be present in order for the Congress to proceed. Delegate Jeremiah Chase of Maryland, how many states are present?
8.
We must have one more state.
I am Richard Beresford of South Carolina.
Mr. President, we now have a quorum.
As your president, I, Thomas Mifflin of Pennsylvania, hereby put to vote the question of whether to ratify this treaty. Who is in favor?
Aye.
The Treaty of Paris is now ratified. I shall sign the proclamation. We must now begin the difficult task of governing our new nation in peacetime from the capital city in Annapolis.
We were in a race, not only a race to get enough delegates here to approve it, but to get that copy back to the English so that it would be valid. The language in the treaty says, if possible, but where they put that phrase, leaves open some interpretation about how much time could go by. Under the strictest reading, we were late in returning the treaty to the English, and they would have, by rights, been entitled to reject it. But they did not. They were tired of the war. They could use the if possible. Clearly it wasn't possible, so we'll use the escape clause, and we have it, and we're all fine. And suddenly everyone was at peace, which had actually happened before in a physical way, but now it happened legally. Congress traveled throughout the war and tried to find a new capital. But that was a difficult operation. They had been in Annapolis, but even Jefferson didn't like Annapolis. He said they didn't have a public building worth the name. But then Williamsburg wasn't much, and certainly neither Richmond, where he was, either. It just wasn't a developed urban environment in the South. So as Congress moved around, there was this effort to settle in.
There have been suggestions by many of the locals, some very notable locals, that they would like to see the Congress remain in Annapolis permanently.
In fact, it was the people of this city that petitioned for the new government to have Annapolis be the capital of the United States. They offered, in free exchange, the State House and acres of land all around it to be the new capital. So this city was very, very invested. They were patriots, most of them, and they were very invested in the victory of the War for Independence and very invested in all the things that happened in 1783 and 84 that brought a conclusion to the War of Independence.
But events did not stop just because Congress had left. Many of the movers and shakers of the early republic were from Maryland and from Virginia, and the Articles of Confederation under which the government was functioning, which eventually came the law in 1781, left so many things uncertain and so many things in the hands of the states. That was willful and intentional. But who was going to referee between states? Clearly the Potomac River was in Maryland, but clearly Virginians needed to use it. Well, they needed to negotiate under what conditions that might be. And so they gathered together on the banks of the Potomac and discussed these things and realized that interstate cooperation might need a referee.
There were commercial differences between Maryland and Virginia that ultimately called for a conference to resolve them, which met in Alexandria, and then eventually at George Washington's invitation was brought to his home at Mount Vernon. Now, George Washington had gone into retirement at Annapolis. He had resigned from the Army and gone home to begin his new life. And yet here he is being pulled in as the host of a conference where Maryland and Virginia are working out terms of commerce and other issues that had come up between them.
It wasn't too long after that various leaders decided that the Articles of Confederation were particularly weak in matters like taxation, where the states voluntarily contributed to the national government. There were all those who were worried about paying off the national debt that had been developed from the war. Quantities of money unheard of in America before that. And so it was here in Annapolis that some of those movers and shakers from 5 different states got together and said, what else can we do? Do the Articles need revision? And in fact, their conclusion was not only did the Articles need revision, they needed to be completely and utterly replaced. And the rise of the Federalists is seen very strongly in the Annapolis Convention, which called for a new convention of all of the states together to discuss a constitution.
So for those years, 1783 and 84, where Congress met here, and then in 1785, where Maryland sends Samuel Chase to the Mount Vernon Conference between Maryland and Virginia, and then in 1786, when it hosts the convention that led to Philadelphia, Annapolis is in the spotlight. That's the Annapolis era.